Okay, so I'm back online. This is the Greeter programming live stream work stream for May 4th, 2018 at 9:55 a.m. And okay, so what I'm doing is I'm building a wrapper around, basically around an LWP client that also stores a cookie jar and will do the cookie protocol. I'm a little bit surprised that this is necessary. But the documentation that I've been able to find so far, this seems to be necessary. This is a thing that I may be moving under the Perl license. Greeter is GPL3. It's actually a GNU Affero GPL3. But I may be moving this under the Perl license, which, if you don't know, is the artistic license. It's the artistic license, which I think was written by Larry Wall, and which no lawyer has any idea what it means, or the GNU GPL version 1, or later. So the GNU GPL version 1 was replaced by version 2 because it was ambiguous in some places. So it's basically either of these two ambiguous licenses or any later version of the GNU GPL, which will include the GPL version 2 that people like and the GPL version 3 that they don't like but that I like. And of course the Affero GPL that Greeter is licensed under, which is not a later version of the GNU GPL, but the GPL version 3 explicitly allows you to use GPL3 code in Affero GPL programs. Affero GPL3 programs. So since you are allowed to use Perl under the terms of the GNU GPL version 3, you're allowed to use it in, or combine it with code from GNU Affero GPL version 3 programs, as long as you Affero GPL the whole thing. So the FSF actually says don't use the artistic license except for Perl code. For Perl code, say this code is available under the same license as Perl itself. And so you will see that on tons of CPAN repositories. Most people probably don't actually know what it means, but it just keeps the license for all of CPAN pretty much uniform. Some people don't follow that rule, but most people follow it, so it's pretty much the same. So okay. So we've got a request, we've got an HTTP request we're performing, some parameters. Oh shoot, why did I do that? Sorry, my apologies. I misread that. I saw up here there's a hash of parameters, but what I didn't realize is that those are arguments to the post function and not actually to the request. So we have one request. It's already got parameters embedded into it. And then another thing we could really use is a JSON post function. So both of those would be worthy Perl libraries to go ahead and push up to CPAN. And then I'm a big fan of getting paid for the code I write, but those are probably small enough that they're not worth messing with very much. And so since I wrote them, I have permission to go ahead and broaden the license and allow people to use them under the same terms as Perl. So we take a request, we add our cookies to it, and then we just delegate to the wrapped LWP clients. So let's try running the test that way. And it died because params is inside of the subtest and therefore not in scope and with login. Okay. So the solution to that obviously is just to make params a parameter to with login and pass it in when we call it. And so then when we move with login to its own file, all we're going to be doing is pushing the code. All we're going to be doing is adding the thing. So lots of imports. My Perl projects always have lots of imports. For global script, I'm going to try to keep most of the imports at the bottom of the file unless they're really truly necessary, although importing croak is really truly necessary because I'm not calling it with parentheses. What am I doing? Okay, apparently I did not get enough sleep last night. Let me fix my moo syntax. So if you're not familiar with moo, has declares an attribute. Perl 5 does not really distinguish between public and private attributes. You can put an underscore in front of a private attribute. It's less magic, it's less functionality attached to it than Python does. But it's there, so you can say, please don't call this from outside the class. I think in Perl, I think in C++, or Java, one instance of a class can access private attributes of another instance of a class. I could be wrong, or private methods. That gives me, to a certain extent, that gives me the heebie-jeebies. To a certain extent, it's a logical consequence of class-based systems and the concept that classes are types, but that's not really object-oriented. Like, class-based systems are not really object-oriented because you shouldn't, in a real object-oriented system, the type of an object doesn't tell you anything about how it's implemented, just what it does. So you have a bunch of parameters that you put on an attribute. One of the parameters is called is, which defines what kind of parameter this is. Obviously, what kind of attribute this is, I mean. Wow. I did not realize I was that tired. So you say is has two possible values. You can say read only or read write. If you say read only, if you don't say is, you don't get an accessor method for the attribute, which means the attribute is there, it exists, but for practical purposes, it doesn't exist, basically. If you say is read only, well, actually, in moo there's three, because there's also is lazy. Say is read only, you get an accessor which only reads the attribute, doesn't do anything else. If you say is read write, you get an accessor which reads the attribute when it's given, called with no parameters, just called on the object, and which writes the attribute when it's called with a parameter. So it's a read-write accessor And then required 1, you can say required 1 or required 0, or you can import, I think MOOPs will import true and false constants. I'm a big fan of true and false in languages where they have different types than 1 and 0. But I'm not a big fan of true and false in languages like Perl 5 where they have the same type as 1 and 0. Like the 1 equals true and 0 equals false is a convention from mathematics. It's not actually a weird programming thing. And mathematicians will multiply by 1 and 0. So it's not even like they're not really numbers. And it's a lot shorter. True and false are pretty important, and they're kind of long names for fundamental constants like that. I think some dialects of scheme call them T and F, and there's a good argument for that. If you could call them like hash T and hash F or something, like decorate them so you know they're keywords and they don't collide with variable names, that would be a really good idea. Can't locate status via package HTTP headers. I think that's an auto load thing, to where it's saying this is a method that I don't understand. I'm going to assume that it's a header name and try to look it up as a header name. I'm not completely sure what's going on there. But the root cause is... What? Interesting. The root cause is that I said status when I meant code. I'm not sure why LWP decided to call that particular method code, but obviously. And so this error, this is a fun error message. Line 148, I forgot to call the request method on set, so I was trying to call set with an argument. Obviously, set is a read-only accessor. If set was read-write, which you should really avoid, especially for public attributes should not be read-write. There is another value for read, by the way, called RWP, which gives you a public reader and a private writer. I think it's like a private read-write accessor. Private just means it has an underscore in front of it, but it helps to remind you that you shouldn't be assigning to an attribute on an object except from inside the methods of that object. There's basically two cases. One case is if assigning to the object could potentially, if assigning a value to the object could potentially break the invariance of the object, in which case it's something that should only be done by a method. You shouldn't allow your clients to do things that could potentially break the invariance of your object. And the other is if assigning an arbitrary value to that object couldn't break the invariance of that object, in which case you can factor your object into basically a product of the rest of the state of the object and this value. And so your object is effectively like a struct or a tuple, with maybe the rest of the object is one component or one field, and this particular attribute is another field, in which case you shouldn't have a mutator, because it turns out that mutable data types are a really bad idea. There's a very few cases where you actually want them. Like if you have an absurdly large structure, if you have an array, mutation is so much faster than treating them as immutable data types. But if your object has 2 attributes, or if it has 5 attributes, if you've got an array with 5 elements, you don't really need to make it mutable. And if you've got an object with 5 attributes, you don't need to be able to modify one of those attributes in place. So again, you really shouldn't have a writer. You should maybe have a method that will return a copy with the one attribute changed, one attribute replaced. So yeah, don't use RW, only use RWP. So anyway, so I called it like this, and what moops did was it said, okay, I'm calling the set method. I'm calling it with 2 arguments, but the set method only takes 1 argument. And so it says, hey, you can't call set like that. It just takes 1 argument, which is $self. That is made more interesting by the fact that moops tries really, really hard. So the Perl method call syntax disguises the fact that $self is an argument to the method, and then moops tries really, really hard in the method definition to disguise the fact that $self is an argument to the method. And so printing out that kind of signature, fantastic. Printing out that kind of signature is probably confusing. I'm going to put some random stuff. And then I don't even care about the contents of a 404. All I care about is that I don't get a 403. I could do like an isn't here instead. So I will. No, I'm not going to do an isn't, because I'm not going to do an isn't, and the reason is it's going to fail. I'm not going to do an isn't because if I accidentally, hang on a sec, I've got probably another recruiter. Okay, so that was a recruiter, but we didn't have a good connection. Probably a recruiter. It was either a recruiter or some kind of spam. I'm going to say that it has to be a 404 because there are other reasons you could get a 403. And I want to confirm, I want to verify that that random stuff is cute, but I'm not going to keep it. I want to verify that I'm actually getting the error message I expect. There are other reasons you could get a 403. And so if somehow, I don't know, I wanted to pin this test that this test requires a path that does not exist, so I know predictably what's going to happen. I don't want somebody to change this URL to something else, which could then return a 403 for some reason unrelated to the absence of a login. Okay, so we now have a valid test, which is going to tell us that if we're in the API directory, you have to have a login. And so we can confirm that. I wrote this code first. Well, that doesn't really matter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out this whole block that checks for the session, and then rerun the test. And it fails because even with the login, we're still getting a 403. Okay, so the problem with being nice to recruiters is that they think you know who they are. And I'm sorry, I get calls from so many recruiters. I have no way of keeping track of the people that are important in my life, let alone recruiters. Come on. Okay, so I've commented out the code that actually returns a 403, and I get lots of test failures. Okay, so I've confirmed. Let me just run the tests again, just to be sure. And then, see, that's the application. The other thing I want to do is get rid of that. Okay, let me go ahead and run the, oops, I don't need that anymore. Let me run the full test suite, because I just want to be sure that all the tests pass real quick. Jenkins would be nice, but kind of out of scope right now. Okay, so I believe very strongly in getting the code done and pushing it out to production and making the user happy and then cleaning it up, which right now we don't have users, but we're going to act like we do. So we'll make the user happy, we'll push the code out into production, and then we'll refactor it. So we're going to limit API routes to logged in users. In a business, you may not be able to do that because once the business is happy, they may not be willing to pay for more developments. Part of the goal of open developed software, I want to give programmers more control. I want to give programmers more leverage. But ultimately, it just comes down to being a disciplined programming shop and saying, okay, we're going to spend X amount of time on certain things because it's a matter of professionalism. So we'll make the user happy as quickly as possible. And you don't, if something's the right way and you know it's the right way going in, you don't necessarily do it the wrong way. You don't necessarily do it the wrong way to start out with. But if you can take a shortcut, especially if it's good development practice, and people will argue with me about this because they'll say I'm not doing it right the first time. But creating this with login function, that's the right thing to do. Putting it in the test file is the wrong thing to do. But I would do it this way as good development practice anyway. I think this is good development practice, even for myself. Get it working as quickly as possible, then refactor it. And since the code is now in a state where the user is happy, push that to production, make the user happy, and then say, okay, we're going to make you happy as quickly as possible, but in order to do that, there's certain kinds of refactoring that we need to do as well. So there's 2 bits of refactoring we need to do. One is pulling with login into its own module, and the other is I'm looking at this again, and this logic, this if condition is backwards. What we should do is say, if we don't have a user session, forbidden. And then if we need to add more tests, we can add more tests and then say pass at the end. So we need to invert the sense of this condition and change the structure of this function around a little bit. And looking at it, this missing param, I'm basically not even going to bother. Like, here you can see I use true. That's actually, I don't think I wrote that code. I think the dancer thing wrote that. I may change it later on, just to say one. It's Perl modules have to return a true value. It's stupid, but it's the reality, and I think you're better off just knowing that Perl modules have to return a true value, something that every Perl developer should learn at some point. And just live with it. I don't think saying true at the end of the file really helps all that much. Maybe it does. So we have that refactoring. But I've accomplished my main goal for today, which is to accomplish something on Greeter. And so my next goal is to accomplish something on GlobalScript, and then I'll come back to Greeter after I've accomplished something on all three of the things that I need to do. So that should be the end of this live stream. This has been the Greeter development live stream for May 4th, 2018. I hope it's been helpful to you, and I will see you later.